During the war years, two converted passenger steamers operated as aircraft carriers on Lake Michigan for the purpose of qualifying naval pilots for carrier duty. Qualifications consisted of 8 takeoffs and landings. The two converted carriers, the Wolverine and the Sable, operated daily from Naval Pier, steaming east or northeast to operate off Naval Station Glenview. The flight group would depart Glenview, rendezvous over the Baha'i Temple, and fly an assigned heading towards the carrier. During the years these two carriers operated, over 13,000 pilots were qualified for carrier duty, including former President George Bush. A variety of aircraft were utilized in this process. The majority were SNJs, but TVMs, F4Fs, SBDs, a few Corsairs, and Hellcats were also used. Quite expectedly, accidents did occur, and as a result, there are numerous aircraft on the bottom of Lake Michigan. Knowledgeable sources indicate that over 175 airplanes, mostly SNJs, crashed into the water. In fact, there are numerous rare aircraft at the bottom of the lake. These two Navy F4F-3 fixed-wing Grumman Wildcats were brought up from the bottom of Lake Michigan in December of 1991. The Navy Museum at Pensacola contracted with A&T Recoveries of Chicago to bring up certain key aircraft for museum display and restoration to static display. These two aircraft, however, were turned over to A&T Recoveries as partial payment of recovery of 12 aircraft during 1990 and 1991. This Grumman, serial number 12260, was manufactured in February 1943 as part of a run of 100 fixed-wing Wildcats to be used for coastal patrol, namely anti-submarine warfare and advanced pilot transition training. 12260 was assigned to Naval Air Station Jacksonville, and then eventually assigned to active war status in Melbourne, Florida, where it flew anti-submarine patrol until reassigned to Glenview, and crashed at 12:09 on March 1, 1944, off the USS Wolverine. While the official findings of the Glenview Accident Board blamed the accident on pilot error, stating that he probably didn't have the throttle quadrant locked fully tight, the pilot, John Forsberg, strongly refuted these findings. It was later discovered that he was absolutely correct. The accident was caused due to a malfunctioning engine that was not developing its full horsepower. The Wildcat settled into the water ahead of the ship, and Ensign Forsberg swam to safety, barely avoiding being struck by the side wheel paddles of the Wolverine. The technology and capabilities of finding and retrieving wrecks in deep waters was not available until the last 10 years or so. The approximate positions of the over 150 aircraft lost from Carrier Qualifications training accidents in Lake Michigan during 1943 through 1944 can be found by researching the deck logs of the USS Wolverine and Sable, which are available from the National Archives in Washington, D.C. The positions are only approximate because a hurried fix was made from well-known landmarks. In this instance, the crash on takeoff of F4F number 12260, 2 water intake cribs 4 miles offshore were used, as they could be seen for many miles out in the center of the lake. Bureau number 12260 rested in 200 feet of water 27 miles straight east of Evanston for almost 48 years, and was discovered with sonar from the approximate position using the 1944 deck log fix. The wreck was then verified as to type and bureau number, as well as condition by remote-controlled robots with lights and TV cameras. The aircraft rested on its main gear and nose, with its right wing broken off, 4 feet from the end, having been damaged probably as it left the carrier. It is easy to see that the aircraft is in relatively good condition, and one can easily see the tail surfaces and the tail wheel, as well as the fuselage and cockpit detail. The cockpit is amazingly intact with only a light dusting of silt from its many years in underwater storage. Except for the instruments, electrical switches and wires, and a few pieces of sheet metal, all cockpit items have been restored to operational condition, including the rudder pedals, control stick, trim, and landing gear mechanisms. It is interesting to note that while the 1944 Official Board of Inquiry report indicated that the pilot did not have the throttle fully forward during the takeoff, the pilot was right, as the underwater footage 48 years later shows. The intact throttle, after all these years, is frozen in full forward position, and that something else must have caused the accident. The aircraft was home to and visited by many fish during its 48 years at the bottom of the lake, and this one may have been the last to swim through the tail surfaces before the aircraft was retrieved. In the afternoon of December 16, 1991, Jim Porter received a call from Mark Clark, inquiring of his possible interest in purchasing one of these two Wildcats. Jim immediately called Dick Hansen to inquire about restoring military aircraft, due to his recent experience in restoring his P-40. They both viewed these airplanes when they were available to be seen in the afternoon of December 18th, and upon arriving to the storage facility, they were amazed with the condition, and it didn't take long for a partnership to be agreed upon by a handshake. And within 1 hour, the second aircraft was purchased by Dick and Jim. As you can see, the condition is remarkable for having been on the bottom of Lake Michigan for 48 years, and subsequent footage will show in detail the amazing condition of the fuselage and cockpit area. As the airplane is seen, certain amazing items need to be brought out. First, the one tire still contained air, and the other was able to be pumped up. The 12-volt battery was cleaned up, took a charge, and will go back in the airplane. The oxygen tank still contained oxygen, and there was some gas in the gas tank. The landing gear cranked up until the chain broke, and all the cockpit controls moved freely. The plexiglass on the front windscreen was reused, and the cockpit is original. The steel parts were rusted, but the fuselage aluminum was in outstanding condition. The paint on the aft inside, the fuselage, and on the cowl inspection panels was preserved with its original markings and decals. The wing and tail surfaces, on the other hand, were in bad shape and required substantial rebuilding with ribs, spinner, and skins. The restoration was 2.5 years in the making and was accomplished by the qualified and experienced personnel at Black Hawk Airways in Janesville, Wisconsin, headed up by Crew Chief Nick Quint. The wings, tail surfaces, and nose column were restored by Ezel Aviation in Breckenridge, Texas. The engine is an 1830-92, built by JRS in Minneapolis. To our knowledge, this is the first aircraft from World War II to be recovered from beneath the water and placed back on flight status. Its first flight successfully took place on Monday, July 18, 1994.
Look at that, no runway at all. Look at the gear come up.
From the Grumman, how everything was going over?
Yes, absolutely great.
Fantastic.
It looked good too, Billy.
Oh, listen to that go.
Just look at that. Look at that. Woohoo! All right.
Although the extremely narrow roller skate landing gear on the Wildcat and the archaic hand crank system of retraction could be understandably intimidating to pilots, once airborne, the Wildcat was a sweetheart. She could be managed in level flying at 50 knots and land on the shortest of decks. The liftoff was at a 3-point attitude at 70 knots after holding the right rudder and full aileron on the roll-up. While maintaining airspeed, the gear crank required 29 turns for full retraction. Making sure the throttle was locked, switching hands, cranking the gear and staying airborne was quite a challenge. The exercise certainly required manual dexterity and a strong right arm. On landing, she didn't like crosswinds. The landing roll was short, and the pilot had to pay close attention as a ground loop was always in the making. Relaxing your attention for 1 minute could result in unbuckling your seatbelt upside down. The F4F Wildcat, built first by Grumman and then by General Motors, played an important role in both the Pacific and Atlantic theaters, and was crucially important in the dark days of 1942, when it was the only fighter in the Navy inventory. The heritage of the Wildcat dated back to the Navy biplanes of the early 30s, and specifically the beautiful little F-3F, designed in 1934. The Grumman, built by the Leroy Grumman Company in Bethpage, Long Island, was legendary for their strength and their simplicity, and the pilots referred to the company as the Bethpage Iron Works. The F-4Fs first flew as a prototype in 1937, having been originally designed, again as a biplane. The first versions were fixed wing. The Navy and Marines received the first 185 Wildcats in late 1940 and throughout 1941, and these were the original aircraft in the inventory when the war started after the attack on Pearl Harbor. The Wildcat's contribution was legendary throughout the dark days of 1942, when all we had was this stubby, little fighter with its 1,200 horsepower Pratt & Whitney 14-cylinder engine and 4 50 caliber Brownings. While outclassed by the Zero, its sturdy construction and tremendous diving speed allowed Navy and Marine pilots to score victories against the legendary Zero and the Betty bombers. Its exploits are now history, from the early defense of Wake Island through the task force operations in the Solomons, leading up to the Battle of the Coral Sea, and again at Midway. Perhaps the Wildcat is best known for its role in the defense of the strategically important airstrip on Guadalcanal during the last months of 1942. Henderson Field, as it was named, was critical to our success in the Pacific and was hotly contested for. The Wildcat operated out of primitive conditions in the hands of Navy and Marine pilots during that month-long struggle, and the F-4F became known as the Cactus Air Force. Our first Navy aces earned their victories in the Wildcat. Names like Joe Foss, Jim Flatley, Commander Thatch, and Butch O'Hare became American heroes in the Wildcat. These stubby little fighters held the day in the hands of brave, competent pilots in a lopsided aerial war until the faster and more powerful Hellcats and Corsairs were available to the fleet. This restored Wildcat is painted in the colors of an identical aircraft flown by Chicago's Congressional Medal of Honor holder, Lieutenant Butch O'Hare, who on February 20th, 1942, single-handedly attacked 8 Japanese twin-engine bombers as they were making their bombing run on the USS Lexington, one of only 4 aircraft carriers possessed by the U.S. Navy at the beginning of the war. O'Hare was one of the most skilled marksmen in his squadron. His initial burst on his first target caused one of the bomber's engines to smoke heavily, slowing abruptly and sending it towards the water. On the same firing run, he hit another bomber in the gas tanks, causing it to burst into flames. Unfortunately, his wingman's guns had jammed due to shifting ammunition. In order to give his leader an unobstructed shot, he pulled out of the area trying to clear and recharge his 4 50 caliber Brownings. Now attacking alone against great odds, Butch O'Hare destroyed in rapid sequence 3 aircraft in the echelon on the left side of the formation. Throughout the attacks, his stubby single-engine fighter was the sole target of every Japanese crew that could be brought to bear. O'Hare, oblivious of return fire, pressed home his attacks, which saved the Lexington. For his actions that day, Lieutenant O'Hare was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. Today, there are only a handful remaining, most of which were built by General Motors as FM2s. There are only 2 flying examples of the Grumman-built Wildcat, seen here. She was not fast, and but she was strong, and she was all we had. And she is well deserving of her place in history, serving her constituents in the darkest hours, when the outcome of desperate battles were often in the hands of a handful of pilots in little airplanes like this. We wish to dedicate this video to the memory of pilot John Forsberg, who passed away in the summer of 1995. 48 years after the fateful takeoff of the Grumman Wildcat, conclusive evidence cleared Mr. Forsberg of the official findings of the Board of Inquiry indicating pilot error. In 1994, John, once again, was in the pilot seat of the fully restored aircraft. John Forsberg, long live your memory, and forever may you fly.